over there?
I do.
Because I didn't. All right. We ready? Excellent. Good evening, everyone. So, question, is Montana the big draw?
Yes.
Or are you sports fans that were familiar with Chad's first book, Champion of the World, which was a bestseller a few years back?
Some of those too.
Some of those too?
Got to cast a wide net in this business.
You do, absolutely true. Proving you're versatile.
Yeah.
You know, Mike Lupica. You know Mike?
Yeah.
Mike is a sports writer, and he has taken up one of the Robert Parker franchises and done a really great job with Sonny Randall. He'll be seeing us in May, I think. So even sports writing is a road to writing thrillers.
Yeah. I always grew up interested in both things, I think. I was kind of fortunate and privileged to grow up in a family of writers. My uncle is a longtime sports writer at the local paper in Missoula, and my grandma was the longtime head librarian at the school district there. So she was.
Wow, you got caught in the crossfire.
Yeah, she was constantly foisting books on us and encouraging us to write and be creative and stuff like that. And my aunt was the director of creative writing at the University of Montana for a long time, so it was great for me because not only was I encouraged to read and write and pursue those kind of arts, but everywhere I looked, people were making a living being a writer, so it was a thing that kind of always seemed possible.
Wow, that was
me.
kind of a false
Right.
picture.
Unfortunately, then when I got into school, it turned out I couldn't do math and I couldn't do science, so I was like, well, I guess I'll try to write. And here we are.
And here you are. Wow. So I forgot to introduce, this is Chad Dundas, who is here with his first thriller or crime fiction, and he is, this month, our Crime Collector's Book of the Month choice. He is the recipient of all-starred reviews, 4 of them, I think, at least 3, from the major book media, who really like the book. I like the book. I don't read those starred reviews till after I've read the book, and then if I agree with them, I quote them, and if I don't, I ignore them. That's how that works out. And it's really true that we are not influenced by reviews or publisher or promotion or anything else. We actually read the books that we sell, and we have what we call a curated collection, just so you know.
Well, thanks so much.
Putnam did not bribe me
Thanks
to do
for
this. Right. And while I'm thinking about it, I meant to mention that Joseph Hinder is going to be here Saturday, but he is teaching a writer's workshop at 4 o'clock. And he is a best-selling and fascinating thriller writer who also teaches writing at Harvard. But he agreed to do the workshop because I asked him to, essentially. And I'm bribing him with dinner afterward, always which works out. So if you decide you want to come at the last minute, you can certainly pay at the door. We'd be happy to have you do that. Which leads me to another question. Have you, in fact, ever taken a writer's course, or are you a self-taught writer?
I've taken a lot of writers' courses. So I have a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Montana, and then got an MFA in creative writing there as well. So I started out actually as an undergrad doing creative writing, and then in my infinite wisdom, I was like, oh, I should learn a trade that I can get a paycheck for, and I will choose the thriving industry of journalism to throw my lot in with. So I became a journalism major, graduated in journalism, seemingly just as the industry itself bottomed out, but worked at the local newspaper for a number of years and have since transitioned into writing for various websites. Work for theathletic.com right now. So yeah, lots of courses. And I always like to tell people that I feel like I learned as much about writing from my journalism professors, and especially from working at a newspaper, kind of being in the trenches every day as I did on the creative writing side of things. To me, they very much inform each other.
So if you're writing commercial fiction, you probably actually learned more at the newspaper than you did in an MFA program. Which skews towards literary very often.
Yeah, that's true. To me, a lot of the things about being a journalist transition well to my fiction. They inform my fiction, just sort of the narrative speed that you have to be able to establish, the economy of language that you have to use, the sort of, especially in sports writing, kind of like the propulsiveness that you have to try to create. To me, those make natural, they cross over naturally to just the way I write fiction. So.
I think that's very true. Also, you're disciplined. I found very few journalists who have writer's block. It just doesn't work that way. And there are many great writers who actually started out, fiction writers who started out in journalism. Michael Connelly, for example, Ace Atkins. So it's an honored tradition. But I always find it interesting that in journalism and in fiction, you kind of invert the structure. So in journalism, you tell the end of the story, sort of, or the headlines, and sort of work your way down to the backstory. Whereas in a novel, you have to go the other way around. So in writing your first novel, how did you, because there's a lot of backstory in this book.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot about our hero that we have to learn, but we can't just learn it in a big chunk up in the front of the book. You have to leak it out, right? Well, in fact, that's a huge amount of the investigation is discovering.
I like to make things difficult on myself.
Well, no, I think that just what would be the point? There would be no suspense in the book if you told us all we needed to know about your guy at the beginning. But how did you master changing the format?
With this, the writing process for this book was much different than my first one, actually. With Champion of the World, the psychological hurdle that I had to get over was just proving to myself that I could write a book. I had never done it before. I had tried and I had failed. My senior thesis at the university when I got my MFA in fiction was supposed to be a novel, and I wrote enough of it for them to let me graduate, but not enough of it for it to actually be finished and be sold and things like that. And the thing that I did with it was I rewrote probably the first 50 to 75 pages like 100 times, and eventually just kind of wrung all the magic out of it for me. There was no creative juice left for me with that book, so I eventually just had to throw it in a drawer. So with Champion of the World, I had this psychological hurdle to get over to prove that I could write a full-length manuscript. And so the way that I did that one was I wrote the whole thing all the way through without ever going back to reread what I had done or edit any of it, just to prove to myself like I could have this stack of papers that represents a completed book. And then afterwards I went back. Of course it was a mess because I wrote it that way, but I went back and edited it, along with a lot of help from other people, a lot of collaboration from other people until it was finally publishable, sellable. And then with this one, it came from a much different place, I would say. Even though I always had it in my mind that once Champion of the World was out in the marketplace, I would probably write mysteries and thrillers. It's the genre that I've always read for pleasure, especially as a kid and then growing up. I still read it, frankly. It's always been my favorite thing. And I thought of Champion of the World as a crime novel, honestly. There's a lot of crime in that book. Everyone's working an angle.
Just to refresh people who haven't read it, it's about the world of professional wrestling, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So, is crime inherent?
You bet. One of the interesting things about professional wrestling, it takes place in the 1920s, and it deals with professional wrestling's transition from being like a hard-nosed, legitimate sport to being a scripted vaudeville sideshow. And one of the things that's interesting about wrestling is that I know, shock. Everyone is shocked. That's why the book works so well, because you get to the twist, and like, it's predetermined. The history of wrestling is largely kept by con men. Everyone in it is lying to you in some way. So that was one of the things that I thought was fascinating about doing fiction about pro wrestling. Like, not only could you kind of bend history and bend the truth to fit your needs, but you were sort of like you were able to use that performance art to kind of play with the nature of reality. Because sometimes the people in the sport kind of don't even know what's real and what's fake. They don't know when someone else is working them on some angle of some kind. So yeah, wrestling was super interesting to me to play with as a fiction writer. But then when I got into writing this one, it had already been sold. I sold it to my editor on the basis of like a pitch that I gave her on the phone. I hadn't really written any of the novel, and so when she decided to buy it, it was incredible. And also I was like, oh no, now I have to write this book. I hope that it works. And like Champion of the World was written from a place of like what I would describe as comfortable anonymity. Mm-hmm. If it failed, no one was going to know besides me and a couple of my friends. This one, if it failed, it would have been bad in a lot of different ways, but like people at the publishing company would know, my agent would know. And that to me was the psychological hurdle I had to get over with this one. Was like
potential humiliation.
Yeah, failure. That was the psychological hurdle, was going to my chair and sitting in front of the computer and working every day, and just like creating and not getting lost in my head of these worries and fears of failure, humiliation, as you say. That's a long-winded answer to your question.
Well, no, it's a good answer, and the truth is, if you hadn't written Champion of the World, finished it, and it hadn't done well, they never would have taken the pitch over the phone. They would have said, write the book. Sorry, Chad. That actually is the way that it works. All first novels have to be complete. Sometimes nonfiction is bought on the idea or the pitch, but fiction, I can't even think of a publisher who's published a first novel without the entire manuscript, even if it's in a state that needs work, being there, because they have to know that you can finish the book. But once you've done that, you've kind of got your creds,
right.
you know, and then it's easier to go forward. So, big leap from the world of wrestling in 1920s to contemporary Montana.
Yeah.
And you're in an interesting tradition. We've had this subject discussed here all month because we've had Nicholas Petrie here, we've had Andrew Grant here, we've had Brand Hunter here. It used to be that the private eye was the kind of champion of people who needed help outside, you know, the structured system. But now what we basically have are vets. We have guys with military training. They've come back, and they're still mission oriented. They still need, you know, some kind of mission. And these are the guys that are now solving problems and, you know, helping people. And it's kind of an old West hero. It's really Shane in a kind of updated form if you think about it.
Yeah.
So your guy has served in the military, and now he's home.
Yeah.
And he's all at sea, so to speak, although he wasn't in the Navy.
Yeah. The main character, there are two point of view characters in the novel, but the primary protagonist is named Matthew Rose. He's a military veteran who has had much of his biographical memory wiped away in the wake of an IED attack near the end of his tour of duty that caused a traumatic brain injury. So he comes back to Montana kind of intent on not only rediscovering who he is and reclaiming his memories, figuring out the events of his past that kind of formed him into the adult that he is today, but also he gets kind of sucked into a present day murder mystery. So that's the primary crux of the Blaze. And like, I kind of wanted, it's interesting that you bring up PIs, because I feel like one of the conscious choices that I tried to make with this book was to cast someone who was outside of that system, cast a main character who was somewhat outside of the traditional like private investigator role. Number one, because I wanted to kind of write a book about, or that was at least set against the backdrop of the New West, the West that I grew up with, the West that was, you know, the people that I was surrounded with, grew up with, and kind of try to avoid the sepia-toned mythologizing that you got in more historical stuff and movies and stuff like that. I wanted to write a book that was told in the realistic West, the modern West. And I also wanted to not necessarily reinforce the power structures that you would get in a PI who maybe the underlying message is that he's going to solve the crime and reinforce the status quo. Like, I kind of wanted a guy who was, not too many spoilers, but in the end going to kind of like break down the status quo of what had been his previous life.
Okay, I don't think that PIs necessarily are enforcing the status quo so much as they are kind of a champion. They're more like a knight on a quest, because they don't have to operate within the police structure or the status quo, and so they can achieve results that a professional investigator in the law system cannot. Your guy's also interesting in that most of these are guys suffering from PTSD. But your guy is suffering from the fact that his memory was erased, which is a different issue.
Yeah.
So he's come back here, and he doesn't. People think he knows things that he doesn't, because it's hard to realize that his memory has been erased.
Yeah.
But why did he come to this particular town? I mean, it is his hometown.
Right.
So is he hoping to recover some of his memory by living there?
Yeah, he gets called back, actually. When he first comes back from the war, he's in Florida, kind of like trying to just reorient himself with civilian life, with normal life. And then he finds out that his estranged father, who was a poet of some renown in Missoula, has committed suicide. And Matthew is the last surviving relative. And so he becomes the executor of the state, of his estate. So he goes back to Montana ostensibly to settle his father's affairs, kind of bring his father's affairs in order, but also I think he's hopeful that he can use it as a key to unlock the memories that he knows are in his mind but that he can't access.
So he's been estranged from his father for quite a long time.
For most of his adult life, as it turns out. And he doesn't remember why. None of the other people around him can quite tell him why. So that's one of the driving mysteries of the novel, is that he wants to find out what caused him to become estranged from his father, and really become estranged from everyone in his previous life. Because Matthew had grown up as kind of an outgoing, normal kid. He was on the verge of being a star athlete, and then some unknown trauma in his adolescence caused him to sort of turn off, like become a substance abuser and kind of push the people in his life away. And eventually I think he wore out all of his options in Missoula and ultimately had to join the military, which came as a shock to all of the people that he grew up around, because he was kind of raised by these sort of pacifist, hippie parents. Right. But he doesn't know why. So he has to try to figure out all of that, like what happened to put him on that track that he was eventually a soldier in Iraq who suffered this injury.
So it's a true track story in the sense, one is he's solving the mystery of himself and his life, and then there's a fire.
Yeah.
And so he has something to work on has happened in real time for him.
Yeah.
And
too many
inevitably
tracks,
we know that these tracks will merge, right? Because this is, I mean, it can't be coincidence, right?
Right.
So what attracted you to fire, to arson, as opposed to other kinds of crimes? I mean, it could have been like a bank robbery or, whatever.
Yeah. There's two fires in this book, one that occurs in the present day and one that occurs in the past, and they are both very loosely based on fires that actually occurred in Missoula while I was growing up. The fire that occurred in the past that is important to Matthew because it starts to unlock those memories is when the candy store in his neighborhood burns down. And when I was a kid, the candy store in our neighborhood really did burn down. Stratton's candy store burned down, I think, in 1988. And you can imagine what a signpost moment that is for a child. Damn, candy store burned down, man. So that had been hanging around in my mind for a long time. And then the other fire was based on a house fire that burned the house of two university employees when I was an undergraduate at the university, working on the student newspaper there. So I think those two stories both were still kind of kicking around in my mind when I went to write.
Attached to the candy store burning down is kind of an immigrant story too, which is a very contemporary issue. Yeah. More so now, do you think, than when the actual incident happened, or we just didn't think of it in the same way?
That's a great question. Like growing up in Missoula, there were a lot of Eastern European and Southeast Asian immigrants who had come over, refugees, and I went to school with their children, of course, and watching them assimilate and how they were treated by people from the town was another kind of occurrence that kind of stuck with my mind. And I guess it's clearly relevant today, even though the story as I told it is kind of based on the environment that when I was growing up as a kid there, but certainly the refugee story even now it's probably more relevant today than then.
There's a huge controversy stirring around us as I speak about a book called American Dirt, which actually is going to be our one of our book club picks for February. And it's a story written by a woman about a family in Mexico who, for various reasons, decide to flee to the United States, and then things happen to them. And she's being assaulted all over the internet because she's not Mexican and she's not an immigrant, and therefore she can't write this story. And I am so sick of this. I'm telling you that this whole thing You know, I mean, was Tolkien ever a hobbit? No. You know, I mean, it just seems to me it's soul destroying for fiction to say, you know, you can only write a story if you're authentically, you know, that person, and it's just killing off imagination and so forth. So I'm fighting back I'm sticking to my guns about this is going to be our February pick, and the publisher is, you know, the problem is that Twitter mobs are so horrendous at the moment that big organizations tend to roll over because they just don't want to face up to the, you know, the hassle. We went through a minor experience of that, supporting an author who got caught in a Twitter mob, and it was really unpleasant. I just went around and erased every time they posted something horrible, we all erased it, and then we put it back up again and carried on. So you're telling the story from an observer. You're not the guy that owned the candy shop that got burned out. Right. You are an observer of it. But you know, I think that we need more people to be writing imaginative stories and not necessarily having had to authentically be the hero in the story. I mean, have you served in Iraq?
No.
Okay.
Yeah,
if you lost your memory? No. So is it okay for him to write about both? Yes.
Yeah. So for me, yeah, I'm dealing with a main character who has a disability. You know, he's had his memory wiped clean. He has this traumatic brain injury, and that of course is an experience that I haven't had. I never served in the military, and so those were the things for me that I had to be really careful with and try to make sure that I rendered in a realistic way, in a way that rang true to the people who have had those experiences. Even though, you know, I'm writing a fictional story about a specific character, so his experience is specific to him and not necessarily specific to everyone who has had those experiences. But at the same time, when you're writing about someone else's trauma, I think you want to be careful and you want to try to listen to their stories. And so luckily for me, I have a number of friends who did serve in the military and did experience conflict and combat in Iraq, and those people were extremely generous in sharing their time with me and going over early drafts of the manuscript, giving me notes on what worked and what didn't. It's a little bit different to get notes on your manuscript from military guys than it is from creative writing fiction people. Yeah, because creative writing people will make the criticism sandwich. They will tell you something positive, and then they'll give you some constructive criticism, and then give you, you know, some more positive stuff at the end. Really? Military guys will just say, you would get your ass kicked in the military if you talked like this, and drew an arrow to the line. Okay, I guess I'll change that. But they were very generous and great with me, and you know, if the military parts work, it is largely due to them, and the mistakes are all mine. So I had them, and then I tried to do as much research about soldiers with traumatic brain injury as I could. And in my day job as a sports writer, I cover combat sports, mixed martial arts primarily. So I ended up writing more about brain injuries than I would like, and I've interviewed some brain researchers, some brain doctors at the Cleveland Clinic who are kind of right at the cutting edge of brain research. And so I tried to research that as much as I could to create what I hope is a realistic rendering, or a rendering that rings true to people who read it, at least.
Well, that's laudable, but I mean, for the average reader, you only need to be convincing.
Right, yeah.
Not necessarily accurate. Because, I mean, I wouldn't know whether what you're saying, you know, in both those respects is actually true or not, but I need to think it's true in order to stay absorbed in the book.
Yeah, the primary goal for me, I guess, I think that there are two ways that fiction writers can approach research. You can try to be really meticulous about it and get everything exactly right, or what I try to do is you have to make sure everything feels true to the world of the story. So you're right, my primary goal is to make sure that, you know, when people are reading it, nothing sticks out to them, jogs them out of the dream world of the story or the experience that they're having as a reader. So yeah, my primary goal is for them to be able to read it and enjoy it without, get entertainment from it without reading anything where they think it's really, you know, it sticks out.
In a way, it's very much like people who write historical fiction have to come up with a way to make the dialogue convincingly 15th century, but actually translatable to a 20th century person. You can't write like Chaucer in his language today and expect anyone to read it. So how do you accomplish that? So I think that fiction is always about that, don't you?
Yeah, and I had to do a lot of that with Champion of the World. I had to make it relatable to a 21st century reading audience, even though that certainly wasn't talking about a time as historically distant as like Chaucer, but the research that I had to do for that one was far more pervasive. So I actually ended up writing a lot of that book in the basement of the university library in Missoula, just so because I would be sitting there writing, and constantly these things like little historical notes would come up that I would have to look up. Like, what kind of meal could someone realistically order on a train traveling between Missoula and Chicago in the early 1920s? So I wanted to be able to just sort of stand up and go into the stacks and find the answer.
But when you think, isn't the harder part trying to deal with the attitudes? I mean, that if you read Chandler today, there's some horrendous racism in it, all the rest of it. So if you're writing about the 1920s, do you sanitize it for today, or do you write it like it was in the 1920s? It's a little different than dialogue, but basically the same problem. Yeah,
and one of the main characters in Champion of the World is a disgraced former African-American wrestling contender who had been regarded as one of the top heavyweight contenders in his day, but then had been arrested and sent to prison. And so there's a racial element, a racial component in Champion of the World. But you're right, like, I think that if anything, I kind of probably toned down the overt racism, because I think it would just be too jarring for people to read, or thought that it would be too jarring for people to read in 2016 when it came out.
Sure, but you can't really sanitize it and be authentic,
right.
So there you are with that. Do you see Matt as a continuing character, or is this book his story?
I wrote it as a standalone, but it's certainly open-ended, and I think if the chance came up to do more, to continue his story in a way that felt organic and natural, I would want to do it. I have a couple of projects that I'm working on now that don't include him, but
who knows?
I'm too superstitious to say. I have a couple of different projects that I'm working on kind of simultaneously to see which one asserts itself in my mind, which one kind of grabs a hold of me and is the one that I become obsessed with in a way that I have to be obsessed with the topic if I'm going to write a whole book about it. They're both contemporary Montana-based mysteries. So in a similar milieu to this, but they take on some different subject matter. But if this was a runaway bestseller and the publishing company was like, we want more Matt Rose, we want more Georgie Porter, who's the other point of view character in the book, yeah, I would probably do it. They could talk me into it.
It's commercial fiction. I remember that. So before we move to questions, tell us a little bit about Missoula, which seems to be sort of a, what's the word I want? I want to say baby. It's a place that seems to generate a lot of writing.
Yeah. Well, it's the University of Montana is there, and the University of Montana historically has had a highly regarded creative writing program, and there have been some titans of crime fiction who've come out of that school and out of that tradition. James Lee Burke lives right outside Missoula. Many of his books are set in Montana. James Crumley was one of them. And so there's a great literary tradition there, and there's a pretty strong crime writing tradition there. And I always, I grew up kind of reading those guys' books and other somewhat lesser known Montana mystery writers. And then, was lucky enough to go to school there and get my MFA and kind of be influenced by some of the current writers there. And so I'm biased, but I think it's a tremendous place and like a great place to set a mystery in a lot of ways. It has a lot of natural qualities to me that make it a good backdrop for a mystery.
Sure, it's a great landscape. C.J. Box is now writing a continuing character in Montana. Keith McCafferty writes in Montana. Trying to think, there's quite a few. Patrick, you know more about this than I do.
Well, it's funny, we were talking in the back
Peter
about
Bowen, right.
some of them, yeah. Richard Hugo and...
Is he the guy that wrote A River Runs Through It?
That's Norman MacLean.
That was Norman MacLean, but Norman MacLean did a little publishing company, and he published Hugo. That's the
Death in the
connection.
Good Life.
Because
Yep.
I thought that mystery that Richard Hugo wrote was absolutely wonderful.
great.
It was just a great book, but I think, and then McLean published it
Yeah.
in his little company.
I
But
just wrote an essay about Montana crime fiction that was in crimereads.com.
yeah,
I was trying to find a copy of that Hugo.
we sold a ton of it. Actually, I own one.
Do you?
No, I do.
I couldn't find one.
Too
I
bad.
didn't read it.
It was pretty. I mean, this is we're actually well into our 30th year, so a lot of these guys we've known, and then Jim Crumley's been here, Jim Burke has been here, Keith McCafferty's here, Peter Bowen. How is Peter, by the way?
I don't know him. I'm not totally sure exactly where he lives in Montana.
Neither are we, which is why I asked.
I think he's
I've
in
read a couple of his
Livingston.
books.
Is
Oh,
he in
he's
Livingston?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and then Keith McCafferty lives in where?
Bozeman.
Bozeman, thank you. Our Montana. Yes, I knew you'd be here today.
Don't forget John A. Jackson.
Oh yeah.
Fantastic
Yeah.
writer.
Right. Yeah, no, there is something wonderful about
Ivan Doig.
I've enjoyed it too. Yeah, it's a border state, which is always interesting. Peter Bowen did a lot with that, with the Native Americans who, of course, don't really recognize formal borders, and then the Métis go back and forth. And Jim still writes about Louisiana, but he's lived in Montana now for a long time, so you're in good company up there.
Yeah.
Indeed. Any of you have questions that you would like to ask? Now's your moment.
Don't be shy. When I read in Portland, my 6-year-old niece and 12-year-old nephew asked some doozies. So I won't lie to you, the bar has been set pretty high. My 6-year-old niece wanted to know why the house is upside down on the cover. And so I was trying
That's a penetrating question.
I was like, that's a great question, Tabby, and I think maybe it's because the guy's whole life is upside down right now.
I thought it was a reflection.
That's what I was going. The reflection in Michael Lake.
Yeah. She said, well, maybe he could turn it upside down, and then his life would be right side up again.
Right there, a
Brilliant.
budding writer.
Brilliant.
I love it. Right. Anyone else?
Yes.
sir.
Do you feel pressure coming from this Missoula tradition and the Montana tradition, writing about the place you've grown up and following in the footsteps of the people that you were just talking about?
Yeah, I don't think that I feel pressure in terms of like trying to be like Burke or Crumley, because come on, probably not going to be like those guys. But I felt a lot of pressure writing a book that was set in my hometown. There was a weird kind of pressure to it, because it should be super easy, right? Especially since like the book is largely set in the neighborhood where I live right now with my wife and kids. But you don't want to screw that up. Like you have to get it right, because a lot of people are going to read it that live in that town, and you want them to recognize that you want it to ring true to them in the world of the book. And so yeah, there was some pressure to it, and like weirdly enough, at times I found it hard to describe things that I see every day.
Yeah.
Like I had to go out and walk around in the neighborhood and kind of be like, oh, pick up details that I would just blow by on a normal day, because it's so familiar to me. I don't even see those things anymore. So I would have to go out specifically to write that stuff down.
So did you write a fire in the spirit of authenticity so you could research it?
No, I talked to my friend Nate Schweber, who's a stringer for the New York Times. There's another Missoula kid I went to high school with, and he has covered a number of arsons. And so I had to call him up and be like, hey man, how do you report on an arson? And he gave me most of the details. He was, again, a great resource for me. And I hope I got it right. I hope it rings true.
How convincing.
Has anybody written any crime fiction about the Bob Marshall? Sounds like that'd be an ideal venue to do.
Yeah.
They fired in 1909.
Right. I know there's a woman whose name escapes me right now, but she writes mysteries that are set in the national parks.
Yeah, Christine Carbo.
Yeah,
It's actually only in Glacier so far.
yeah. So she is doing that. A couple of Gwen Florio, who's a Missoula mystery writer's books are wilderness based, but I don't know if they're in the Bob or not. But that's a great idea. I should write that down.
Wasn't there one, Patrick, about horses, a woman and horses in Montana, or am I totally confused?
Gosh.
There are quite a few.
I remember Jenny Seiler wrote a couple.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Jamie Harrison.
right.
And
But
that's
more
not the one you're
recently.
talking about.
No,
Yeah.
sorry.
I don't. remember.
A factor of old age is that names just float away out of your mind. Well, they don't. It's the retrieval system. It's working too hard. And I will, in the middle of the night, sit up and say, aha, it was.
It's in there
Proving
somewhere.
that you don't actually lose your memory when you get old. You just can't get to them fast enough. Fortunately, that hasn't happened to you yet.
You had Christine Carbo.
You did.
That was right there.
Yeah. And Nevada Barr earlier, but she wrote a book about Glacier, but Christine is actually sticking to Montana.
Yeah.
Very good writer, too. I really enjoy them. Anyone else? No? Well, then we're going to be done early.
Oh, Skylar again.
Would you say you're exclusively a crime fiction writer at this point? Novelist?
It's kind of my plan to do that moving forward.
Okay.
Like I don't want to make you a promise that will be the only thing I do, but yeah, for the time being, I mean that's really what I always wanted to do. So
Gotcha.
as long as they'll let me keep doing it, I'm going to do it.
Not going to branch off into science fiction or
Well, I mean, if I
in Montana, it's possible.
yeah, no. The other day I was like just hanging around. I got an idea for like a Wild West horror novel, and so I had to sit down and I like wrote out the whole plot on a piece of paper so I wouldn't forget it. So maybe, who knows?
The Gothic and horror is coming back. It's
Yeah.
a big resurgence, so maybe you will do well with that. Right? Yes, sir.
Champion of the World had a lot of like good twists, and this one has like a lot of blurbs about twists. How do you come up with those unexpected things?
That's a great question. I would love to tell you that I sit down and outline the whole thing from start to finish,
I didn't quite
and
catch that.
and that I know where it's all going to go when I start. But that's totally not the case. Like with both books, I started out, obviously with a starting place and a general idea of where I wanted to finish, but I can never really tell. Like once the characters start becoming fleshed out to me in a more complete way as I work on it, I can never tell like exactly where they're going to go, like the twists and turns that it's going to take. And like some of the twists in Champion of the World were like occurred so organically and kind of like out of the blue that it dumbstruck me, honestly. Some of them, like, well, I guess we already did this spoiler, but like when the main character finds out that the match he's supposed to have is going to be rigged and rigged in his favor, I was actually writing that scene, and then at the end of it I was like, oh, of course he's gonna win. They'll rig it for him to win. So it was like a little light bulb moment for me, and I was also like, probably should have thought of that sooner. Probably should have known that all along, but I'll take it.
Maybe you just have to get used to the characters,
Yeah.
because a lot of the twists come out of the way the character is written, and you don't always know that at the outset.
Yeah.
But you did know where you were going to the end, right? You just didn't know how you were going to get there.
Yeah. Especially with the Blaze, I think I knew what the outcome was going to be, what the sort of revelation of the mysteries was going to be.
Right. But how that road
Yeah.
wandered, you could take a few loops and a detour, and
Yeah,
that would be
for sure.
okay, right?
Especially with the other point of view character, Georgie
Right.
Porter, who is the character who is probably most closely, like near and dear to my heart, because her own past is the own life experiences most closely mirrors my own, probably, of any character that I've ever written, because she's a small town newspaper reporter, which is what I did for several years, and she's grown up in much the same way that a lot of the people that I knew and myself sort of grew up. But like when I started the book, I knew that Matthew was going to be in it, but Georgie kind of came along early in the process, but somewhat later than he did. And part of the reason was, like you said at the beginning, you have a character who's lost all his memory. And so in order to kind of like tease out his own past, and there are things that the reader needs to know that Matthew doesn't know.
Exactly.
So I needed to have Georgie in there.
A person who
Yeah,
knew,
a
and
person who,
right.
who could tell the reader and also tell Matthew. And so she, over the course of the book, really kind of came alive for me, became a fully realized, fleshed out character. And so she, a lot of the twists and turns that happened in her narrative arc or plot line were unexpected to me. They just kind of came about as she became more realized.
The truth is, if it were only Matthew telling us the story, he would be a truly unreliable narrator, right? Because he couldn't remember.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to bring off if the point of the book in part is to restore him in his memories. He can't really do that unassisted.
Yeah.
So you know, it's a, you set yourself an interesting challenge, I think.
I was kind
with
of naive
Matthew.
about it. I think when I started, I didn't, I didn't totally know how interesting it was going to be to write a character that didn't retain any of those memories. And then, as I got into it a little bit, I started to realize more and more like how limited he is in his capacity to not only have those memories, but we as humans are like an amalgamation of all of our previous experiences. And so
Right.
he doesn't have those, so he's kind of experiencing life in the moment, you know, trying to find his way around in the neighborhood where he grew up, literally like left turn, right turn, what he sees. Like he's experiencing life at that level. So again, like Georgie Porter had to come in and kind of provide more of that interiority and depth of field in a way.
Is there anything you'd like to say about the book we haven't covered?
No, like I think that covered a lot of it. I just, like, again, my primary goal is that I hope that it's entertaining. So if you guys read it, I hope that you like it.
Well, we thought it was entertaining, and we only have a few left. Just mentioning that. So I'm going to thank our video audience for joining us tonight, and I hope that it was actually a very interesting discussion in terms of just writing, you know, not just about the story, but how to write, and if I can ever